Let's introduce ourselves. Cody, why don't you start?
Sure. Hi, everyone. I am a science fiction writer. Well, I say that. So I have two books, which are um, cyberpunk alternate history. So when I write long fiction, it just tends to be kind of in that science fiction vein. But I do write urban fantasy when I do short fiction. For whatever reason, that seems to happen. So later on, I'll be reading a ghost story for you all.
Kim?
Hi, folks. I'm Kim Fielding. Hopefully, I've got my earbuds working. You can all hear me okay now? Good.
Yeah.
You know, tech is not my thing. You'd think it would be at this point.
Oh, no.
But okay, good. So my name's Kim Fielding. I write gay romance mainly in a lot of spec fic fields, and I've recently started sort of branching out. I co-wrote a horror novel with Fred Feely, and I just finished the manuscript for a space opera. So I'm kind of branching out a bit.
That's so cool. And my name is Kellie Doherty. I'm a queer science fiction and fantasy writer who lives in Eagle River, Alaska. I write speculative fiction, so sci-fi, fantasy, short stories, slash fiction, poems, novels. I have 4 books out right now, and I'm currently working on a 5-book fantasy series called The Broken Chronicles. So yeah. So now that we're done with the introductions, let's move on to the reading. I get to go first. So the book that I'm going to be reading from today is called Curling Vines and Crimson Trades. It is the second book of the 5-book fantasy series that I was talking about. It's an adult fantasy manuscript that's centered on a rare goods trader named Orinda Silverstone. Her wife gets kidnapped, and she has to do these nearly impossible tasks and trades just to get her wife back. The problem is her best friend also has a task list, and the final one is to kill Orinda. So it has themes of like trust, reconnecting with someone you've lost in the past, and trying to speak when others are trying to silence you. So yes, this is the book I'm going to be reading from. Second book in the fantasy series that I'm writing. And for FYI, the first 4 books have their own main character, and it's been really fun to try to write that, because then the 5th book is going to bring them all together. So it's kind of like an Avenger style. It's been really, really fun. It's supposed to be standalone, but you should read all of them anyway. So let's get going. I'm going to read 2 snippets for you guys today. The first one is in the very beginning of the book, page 2, actually, for a little bit of backstory. Orinda and her wife, Nos, are about to go to bed. It's broad daylight, and they just want to go to sleep. They do hear a noise outside, but they decide to just ignore it because they're both really tired. A deafening crash, followed by the cascade of splintering wood and glass, disrupted the quiet moment. Orinda shot to her feet. Sunlight spilled inside like liquid fire, backlighting the figures that crawled in. They carried curved bronze swords and wore long, hooded white robes. Orinda gasped. Panaraya's worshippers. Worshippers of the evil sun goddess, rival and sister of the moon goddess Orinda worshipped. Her followers were known to be malevolent, spreading bloody chaos in the name of the deity. 5 of them had just broken into Orinda's home. Nos screamed. Her eyes glowed blue, and as her crafting took its toll on her body, a matching glowing wound inched its way open across her cheek. Dark blue blood dripped down her skin. She winced. A bubble of cobalt energy burst from her, forming a wall and slamming the intruders away. Orinda's fear turned to fury. She charged forward, heading for her own weapon. One intruder rose faster than the others, but Nos used her crafting again, and an azure wall pummeled the figure like a wave. Grabbing her sword, Orinda turned, weapon ready. They attacked as one, but Orinda ducked, parried, and slashed, holding her own between them and Nos. Anger boiled inside of her. She grabbed one of the intruders, a man with a black beard that nearly hid his wicked grin, and stabbed him in the stomach. His death groan fueled her. A female with a scar across her neck got lucky, slicing Orinda's arm. Sharp pain followed the blade as it bit into her skin. Orinda sidestepped, carrying the second sweeping arch of the woman's blade to the wooden floor and kicking her in the side. A sickening crack sounded, and the woman screamed. Orinda sliced her neck. The woman's yell ceased. Arenda leapt back as a third slice nicked her cheek, the attacker misjudging the distance between them. Fire burned under her eye, but she lashed out. How dare they come into my home? Her sword glinted until all five lay dead. Nos. Panting, she looked back at her wife, who stood beside the bed, trembling, eyes still glowing blue. A sixth intruder snuck up behind her. Where did he come from? Arenda threw out her hand. Her elu blood sung with power, but she hesitated. Her heart pounded. What if I make it worse? Broken long ago and shattered like the glass on the floor, her crafting had become hard to control. She charged instead, lifting her sword. Nos, to your left, she yelled. Nos turned just in time to see the intruder raise his weapon and smash the hilt onto her head. She slumped over. Arenda's heart clenched, but the intruder grabbed Nos's arms, drawing her onto his shoulders. Something hard hit her from behind. White, hot pain lanced through her head, shuddering down her neck and shoulders. Arenda's world brightened, spun. She fell to her knees, catching the side of the bed to keep from falling flat. A hand grabbed her bushy hair, pulling her back, and a rough cloth bag slipped over her head, blinding her, suffocating her. Nos! Someone pulled her hands behind her back and chained them together. She had to do something. Her chest tightened, each breath a struggle against the cloth. Still, she fought. When someone tried to pull her to her feet, she reared back. A satisfying crunch and pain blossoming in the back of her skull told her she'd met her mark. The intruder groaned. Good. Once standing, she kicked, but hands grabbed her foot and twisted. Her ankle wrenched to the side, and a deep ache shuddered up her leg. She yelped, landing hard on the floor. Her ankle throbbed, her head pounded. Still, she struggled, thrashed, flailed. Fear drove her to fight. Nos, she thought, I have to get to Nos. Sudden pain cracked the side of her temple, and Arenda knew no more. So that's the first snippet that I wanted to read for you guys today. The second one is quite a bit further along in the book. It's chapter 21. Nos gets kidnapped. Arenda is tasked with doing all of the nearly impossible tasks and trades. She's having a particularly terrible night of it. It's raining, she's in a cart, there's no hood over her, it's just really terrible. So here we go. Arenda pulled her cloak tighter and stared out into the storm. As dark rain clouds billowed, her thoughts turned to Nos. She wondered if a bloodcrafter had healed Nos's cuts and bruises from the vines wrapping around her. If anyone had taken care of the sharpened vine through her arm. What if she was still there, trapped against the cold stone floor? Alaraya had warned Arenda to move fast enough, and she didn't feel like she was. Arenda and Nos had been in a rainstorm like this once. They had been picking red sari berries, and rain ran in rivers down Arenda's skin. She could almost feel Nos's hand holding tight. That night, she hadn't cared that it was cold, or that their home was still a long walk away. Nos's smile was all the warmth Arenda needed. Her arms, the only home Arenda longed for. As real lightning flashed the sky above Arenda and the cart, the conversation her and Nos had that night drifted through her mind. Light had flashed that night too, illuminating Nos's pale features. Quite the adventure, my love. Nos had to yell to be heard over the crack of thunder as more lightning brightened the sky. It always is. Arenda pulled Nos closer. Worth it for the fruit? When Nos lifted their linked hands together and placed a kiss on the back of Arenda's, her skin tingled. Worth every step with you, Nos replied. She pulled away, jumping into a puddle, splashing water and laughing. Her blue traveling cloak had whipped around her that night, the wind tugging at her clothes, just like it was doing to Arenda's now. Arenda pulled her cloak tighter, letting the memory burn in her mind's eye, drawing warmth from the cinders of her past. Nos's drenched hair stuck to her forehead, cheeks, and lips in dark lines. Her eyes sparkled with mischief. She looked like a fierce rain goddess, like she can control the winds, the waters, the storm itself. But Arenda had a streak of mischief too. Leaning down, she scooped up a handful of mud. Nos's eyes grew wide, her grin even wider. You wouldn't dare. Arenda pulled her hood tighter around her head, tucking her chin into the rough, damp cloth, smiling as more of the memory came back to her. I dare. She slung the mud ball at Nos and hit her square in the knee. Mud splashed onto Nos's pants and down her boot. She yelped, and for a heartbeat, Orinda worried she'd gone too far. But then Nos grabbed some mud of her own and splattered it against Orinda's chest. Nos went to grab another and slipped, frantically grasping for a handhold. Orinda caught her, but Nos's momentum pulled harder. They both fell, splashing to the ground. Nos chuckled, eyes glinting. You did that on purpose. Orinda's accusation only made Nos giggle more, and Orinda couldn't help but join in. When was the last time I had laughed, Orinda thought. Truly laughed. She couldn't remember. Surely not since Nos had been kidnapped. Ages then, an eternity. She had wrapped an arm around her wife that night, and her arms ached to do that now. Nos snuggled closer. They kissed, lips pressing against each other softly at first, then harder. Everywhere Nos touched warmed to embers, one hand slipping under Orinda's tunic and the other cupping her chin until she was a strung-out bow, ready to be let loose. Orinda's stomach fluttered. She imagined Nos doing the same here, now. How lovely that kiss, those heather light touches would feel, even in the pouring rain, just like they had that night. They had shared a deeper kiss, one of connections and memories and the promise of a future together, one that spoke louder than the rain and the thunder, one that flashed hotter than the lightning sparking through the sky. Something hard jabbed her side, and Orinda startled awake. And that's it. So those are the two ones that I wanted to read for you today. Just wanted to showcase the relationship between Orinda and Nos. So up next, we have Kim. Oh, you're mute.
No, somebody always has to tell me that at least once. I teach for a living. You would think after a year I'd have figured out Zoom, but no. So thank you. That was lovely. I'm going to be reading to you today from my most recent book. It's called The Muffin Man. And I don't really need to give it much setup because I'm going to read from the very first scene. I will mention it's part of a shared world series. There will be, by the time we're done, 12 books in this series, and what they all have in common is there's a magic shop that shows up in unexpected places, but you can read the books in any order you want to because the magic shop is really the only unifying theme. So I'll just start right in with it. The bread wasn't quite perfect. Oh, it was good. Almost everything Morley baked was tasty. But this time he was working with a sack of mysterious grains acquired from a trader who claimed they were from a kingdom far to the north. And because the grains were special, Morley thought the loaves should be special too. He'd used expensive thirst flower honey as a sweetener, hoping it would set off the nuttiness of the grains. Yet as he chewed, he decided that the honey wasn't quite right. It was too ethereal. These grains called for something earthier. Apple juice might work, but last year's apples were gone and it was too early for this year's. But what about catberries? Hadn't he seen a basket of them just behind Your Highness? Morley turned around slowly, annoyance and dread swirling in his stomach, to face the stern-looking assistant chamberlain. I'm baking, Morley said, although it wasn't exactly true. Their Majesties wish to see you immediately. Both of them. Oh, demons, doorknobs, that meant trouble. Let me just get my dough rising and then immediately, sir. Morley untied his apron and hung it on a nearby hook, then gave his hands a cursory wipe with a damp towel. He was wearing an old tunic and hose, which was hardly appropriate attire for a royal audience, but immediately meant there was no time to change. He hoped they didn't scold him over his clothing, too. Fretting silently, Morley followed the assistant chamberlain out of the kitchens, up 2 flights of narrow servant staircase, through a series of small rooms, and then down a long hallway hung with faded tapestries. Demons, doorknobs! They were heading for the blue cabinet, which meant Morley would face his parents without an audience. That was never good news. When he entered the room, he realized the situation was even worse than he'd feared. Under the cobalt-hued ceiling, standing among the desks and chairs and chests, were not just his mother and father, but also his oldest brother, Prince Algar. The assistant chamberlain exited and shut the door, leaving Morley to the mercies of his family. Your Majesties, he said to his parents, executing a credible bow, then to his brother, Your Grace? Enough with that! The Queen waved her hand impatiently. Sometimes Morley could pacify the king with exceptionally proper court etiquette, but his mother was never impressed. And now she scowled at him. "You have something on your cheek." Automatically, he swiped at it. "Flower, ma'am, I'm sorry. I was told you wanted to see me right away, and I didn't have time to." "Yes, because of course you were in the kitchens again." In a perfect world, Morley would have taken that opening to explain that he'd just obtained a sack of intriguing exotic grains, and that if he experimented just a little more, he believed he could find the perfect combination of ingredients and techniques to create delicious bread beyond anyone's imagination, the types of loaves poets would write sonnets about, if they wrote sonnets about bread, which they didn't as far as he knew, but they should, because what in the entire world was more wonderful than a loaf still warm from the oven, crunchy on the outside and soft within? Anyway, it wasn't a perfect world. His parents wore twin expressions of disapproval, while Algar, who stood slightly behind them, was making the same face as when they were boys and he was about to push Morley down a flight of stairs and then tell everyone that Morley had tripped. So Morley simply nodded. "Yes, ma'am." The king grunted. "A waste, a scandal and a waste. We have servants to prepare our food. That is what servants are for. You are a prince of the kingdom of Udrodia, not a scullery boy." Morley had heard this lecture before. He tried to explain that baking was a noble and honorable pursuit. As pursuits went, it was least as worthy as the hunting and dice playing and drinking that occupied the time of his middle two princes. Everyone in the castle enjoyed his food, including the king and queen themselves, and when royalty from other kingdoms came to visit, they always exclaimed over the quality of the baked goods. But those arguments had previously gone nowhere, so now he gritted his teeth and said nothing. The queen walked closer, her skirts rustling commandingly. She wore so many layers that it was difficult for her to sit. Rumor was it took 2 hours for her chambermaids to dress her and another 2 for them to get her ready for bed, and that didn't count any changes of outfits for them during the day. Morley thought baking was much more useful than spending the bulk of one day's putting clothes on and taking them off, but he wasn't going to say that. He valued his head too much. "Morley," the king said, her lips curled in a rare smile, "we have an undertaking for you. If you're successful, you will more than make up for years of disappointing us, disappointing our subjects." I don't think most of the kingdom cares what I do. They have other things to worry about. He'd seen how people lived outside the royal palace, and he was certain that keeping their families housed, fed, and in decent health were much bigger concerns than how royalty spent their time. "I care what you do," she bellowed. The king nodded vigorously. Algar sneered. "The family has ruled for over 700 years, a dynasty few kingdoms can match. 700 years from now, our descendants will still rule, and when they view our portraits in the Hall of Ancestors, they will look upon us with pride. They will not make jokes about the prince with flour on his cheek." "No jokes about the spit-boy prince," Algar chimed in, both inaccurately and unnecessarily. The king and queen ignored him. Sorrow bowed Morley's shoulders. He'd known his parents would never be proud of him the way they were of his brothers, who were good at shooting things and making snooty quips while standing around in fancy attire. But it hurt that they held him in such contempt. He was good at baking. Why couldn't that be enough? "What is it you want me to do, ma'am?" he asked quietly. She made a triumphant noise and gestured at the king, who strode to her side. He was always well turned out, famous for wearing clothing of burgundy velvet with extensive gold embroidery. He had a servant who did nothing but keep his lush gray beard in order. As a young man, the king had been a hero in a minor skirmish he liked to call a war, and shortly after his homecoming, his older brother, Vasman, had died from an allergic reaction to clams. Everyone had known that shellfish could be fatal for Vasm, and the cook who had prepared his dinner that night swore he hadn't used any seafood in the stew. But the cook had been beheaded for his carelessness, and Morley's father had become heir, and a few years later, king. He'd married a second cousin, and they promptly produced 4 sons, which, palace gossips like to whisper, were rather more than needed to ensure the continuance of the line. The king stroked his beard. "You have heard, I assume, of the plight of Princess Osen of Varelum?" Everyone had heard of her misfortune. For years, it had been the talk of all the kingdoms in the region among nobility and commoners alike. Bards sang songs about it. Puppeteers put on shows in the village squares. Years earlier, the king and queen of Realm had insulted a sorcerer. A foolish thing to do, but unfortunately easy. Sorcerers tended to have thin skin. This one placed a curse on the family, and when the princess reached her 16th birthday, she fell under an enchantment. Sorcerers differed as to the means of the enchantment: a spindle, an apple, a mirror, an imp, but everyone agreed on the result. Poor Osen ended up imprisoned in a tower surrounded by an impenetrable bramble. Her parents had promised her hand in marriage and an enormous fortune to anyone who rescued her, but everyone who tried ended up impaled on the thorns. Oh no. Morley took a step back. I don't want to marry Princess Osen, and we don't need a fortune. We're wealthy already. The king shook his head. That is not the point. Additional income is always good, of course, and an alliance through marriage with Vreeland would be welcome despite your personal tastes, but you can always have sex with men on the side, Algar pointed out. As long as Osen pops out an heir or two, nobody will care who you sleep with. The queen shot Algar a fierce glare, and he cowered a little, which was gratifying to observe. But then the king continued. But irrespective of the money and the political advantage, your quest will serve the greater good of bettering your reputation. The youngest prince of Vidrogia will be known as a hero and not as a pot boy, Algar said. But what if I die? The king raised a finger and boomed out his response. Some show their valor in life, and some become champions in death. And that's all I have for. I did want to mention one more thing. I forgot to mention at the beginning. The book has recipes at the end, so if you get hungry while reading about the baking, you can make my family recipes. And Cody, you're up.
I am excited about those recipes and the description of bread being the best thing ever when it comes out of the oven. I definitely agree. So thank you, Kim. I'm going to read from a story called Unquiet Baggage. It's in the first Made in LA anthology, which is, this is an anthology series that collects stories that are set in Los Angeles. There have been 3 thus far. It's volume 1, volume 2, and volume 3. I'm going to read from volume 1 because, and it's, a bunch of different authors, because this short story happens to fit within the time frame completely. So this is not an excerpt. This is the totality of it. Maybe I am a ghost. I don't know. That seems so typical. I know I'm not an echo, a resonance, a specter, or any of the other terms thrown around by people who don't know anything about the dead. What I am is a collection of chopped up body parts tossed in a suitcase and carried onto the gold line by my husband, my murderer. At least he's not carrying me in a leaky sack. It's really not fair that I ended up this way. When we met in high school, Michael was the sweetest, though sometimes he would punch walls and his sweat always had an angry shine to it. But he also said things like I was his moon and stars. He wanted to pamper me. Pamper is a funny word for a 15-year-old to use. I ate it up. Michael was my bae, my boo, my lover, and my husband. Now, years later, he's my killer. The sad part is that I'm sad for him for killing me. The sad part is that I'm also sad that he's going to get caught. Ghosts can be many shades of sad, it turns out. You can't just bring a suitcase full of body parts onto the gold line and expect to get away with it, I want to yell at him. But he's not listening to my advice, my emanations, or whatever. He's making shifty eyes at everyone on the train. That black lady has his number. She's going to call the cops as soon as he's not staring her down. Same with that white beardy hipster with the square framed glasses that look like they're made of popsicle sticks. Meanwhile, I can smell the homeless guy 2 seats down. I'm a dead guy in a suitcase and he smells bad. Fuck LA sometimes. I'm not glad I'm dead, per se, but I don't mind that much. There's something better on the horizon. I'm waiting for something, and it's going to be good and glorious. The train car wobbles and winds its way slowly through South Pasadena. My death comes at a bad time in my career. I rocked social media. I could tell you all the trending hashtags, engagement tricks, click through ratio targets, and the keys to maximize discovery. Michael thought I was a fucking wizard. I'll be honest, I didn't get with him because of his brains. He had a fire inside of him that's so rare these days, so sexy. Everyone is so totally, yeah, like whatever, like chill and stuff. Why get upset? Why get excited? Why not go to sleep one day and never wake up? Michael was the exact opposite. Everything got to him, the good and the bad. I brought home a silly little cupcake one day that said J plus M equals love. He cried. He cried a lot today. I don't know if anyone else on the train can see it, but me, being incorporeally and weirdly perceptive in my specter form, I can see salt tracks on his cheeks. He was crying as he chopped me to pieces in that abandoned restaurant. It's not that he didn't love me, it's that his heart wasn't made for the long haul. I'm genuinely curious how he thinks he's going to get away with this, what he thinks comes next. Say he buries me somewhere. My guess is Eugene Debs Park. He'll probably carve our initials in a nearby tree, which is how they'll find my body. Keep in mind, he's only got a garden trowel stuffed in with me, so it's not like he can dig very deep. If he buries me and goes home, then what? He'll never recover. He'll miss me so badly. He'll want to pamper me, but I'll be gone. It actually is sad when I think about it in a distant, hey, did you hear about that dead guy in a suitcase kind of way? Maybe I'm in shock. Oh my God, that's exactly what a ghost is, isn't it? Something bad happens, creates a shock, and then the ghost just somehow sticks around. Poor Spectre can't move on because, shocker, he was chopped up and stuffed in a suitcase. This wasn't supposed to be on the gay agenda. Michael stands, preparing to get off in Highland Park. This suitcase itches. I can feel his discomfort, the shakiness in his arms and legs, but he can't let go of me. I can't let go of him either. He drags my pieces off the train, boards a bus, and then gets off again at Home Depot? Ugh, I picture him dragging me through the aisles, or maybe propping the suitcase in a shopping cart, my pieces dripping, leaving a trail that follows him around the store as he searches for a good shovel. But no, and this is the weird part. He doesn't go into the store. He lurches around the parking lot until he finds a spot next to the pillar supporting the 110, where it vaults over the river and tears through the Elysian Park hillside. I can see pavement soaked in motor oil and beds of stained cardboard boxes covered in pigeon droppings. Shit, this is depressing. I thought he would go to the park or maybe just the river and get on with it. What the fuck are we doing here? I want to leave. I want to go somewhere with a beautiful vibration. I'm alone now while he walks over to the day labor crew and barters for something. He wants, oh God, he wants lighter fluid and matches. This is so pathetic. The least he could do is blowtorch me and leave nothing but ashes. His plan won't work. I'll be turned to bits of bone and charred flesh while he weeps, thinking about how stupid he is. I thought maybe he'd come out of this, I don't know, changed maybe, ready to give himself over to a grander plan, atonement, confession, redemption, that whole thing. No, he's a failure. It's embarrassing to watch. It's dusk now. What few people come and go are clustered near the bright orange signs and the well-lit areas. The taco truck chugged away an hour ago. This end of the parking lot is abandoned. He opens the suitcase, but he doesn't remove my pieces. He splatters my remains with flammable liquid. Good and wet, he's got me. Now he's fiddling with the matches, but he's shaking so badly he can't do it. This is the worst twisted sexual replay anyone could imagine. Finally, he gets one lit, and in the flare, I see he's crying again. There are two very clean tracks down his face, which is otherwise grimed by the terrible, no good day he's having. Will he go get a taco on Fig after this? My one hope is that he doesn't end himself by walking into traffic or jumping off a bridge. His silent, tear-stained company is too much right now. If we could talk, specter to specter, I might lose my mind. Despite my snark and doubts, the flames are having a powerful effect. Maybe it's the ritual of it. Fire is an ancient and profound thing. I try to manifest before him, looking as I did in high school, innocent, his moon and stars, so he can see what he's lost. If I could show myself to him as an old man, I would give him a gut punch. That's what galls. All those years. I won't get to find out what I could have become. I give up. I'm better off free. Goodbye, Michael. Husband, murderer, failure. I'm going to a place in the universe that sings. So, made in LA. If you want to read more, there's more stories in there. I'm going to remove myself from Spotlight.
That was awesome, Cody. Good job, guys.
Yeah, it's fun to pop on together and hear your stories. I do have a couple questions for you.
Yes, hold on a second. We do have a question in the chat.
Ooh.
Kim, you have a question. Tell us how the whole shared world writing process works for Kim.
That's a lot of fun. So I should say it wasn't my idea. It was Megan Maslow came up with this particular one. And she gathered, in this case, there were 14 authors because two people worked in pairs. And she wrote a short story that sort of served as our basis, and that had this shared world component in it, which is the Marsden's Magic Emporium. And we agreed on some basic ground rules about what the Magic Emporium looks like and how it works. Like, it can only show up in the same place once, and when people go there, they can only get the one thing that they really need, and they often don't realize why they need it. Like, my guy ends up with 3 raven feathers and has no idea, because the other half of my story takes place in Modesto, California, and he has no idea what's going on. So we each had that one particular part, and from there we kind of did our own thing. So you get a bunch of really different stories, and it's so much fun because you have this inspiration from the beginning, and you can see all the different directions different people can take the same source.
Very cool. Oh, that sounds like so much fun. A lot of work though too, because you have to collaborate with so many different authors to make sure you get it right.
Yeah, fortunately, in this one, and I did another shared world series in the past. There's kind of just this one little piece that you all have in common. So once you kind of get that, you can go off from there. So I work well with sort of a prompt, and this was a great prompt. So
cool. So it looks like we don't have any other questions in the chat. So we've actually prepared our own questions because we're super prepared, man. Kim, why don't you ask one of yours?
I don't remember what mine are. I'm so sorry.
Okay, Cody, how about you ask one of yours?
I had a question for you, Kelly, and it was about the mythology. So the worship of the gods and goddesses. I noticed that was like a big part of your stories. Like, but tell me more about like how you go about kind of like filling out that pantheon, or what that means for the people on the world versus the gods. I'm curious.
Yeah, that's a great question. So for my gods and goddesses that I have in my world, I wanted to play with the aspect of light and dark. Normally in sci-fi and fantasy, dark is dangerous. There's danger that lurks in the shadows. You don't want to see what's underneath your bed because it'll go bump at the night, kind of thing. In my world, darkness is actually really great because all the monsters come out during the daytime. And the
Mm,
sun goddess is actually the evil one, is actually the mean and malevolent one, whereas the moon goddess is the gentle one. And those are the two main sister rivals, main goddesses in my world. And there's others that filter beneath them that may or may not be actually real, but the main two goddesses. And then basically, if you worship Alaraya, you're probably a good person. If you worship Panaraya, you're probably not a good person because their teachings are very, very different about what you should actually do in the world. And Sun Goddess is very much raise them, burn them until you get your point across. And the Moon Goddess is not that at all. And so that's actually one of the main conflicts of it. And I also wanted to showcase for Arenda, since she is such a believer, that one of the things that some people might think is if you're queer, you can't be religious, because sometimes those are very like not the same thing. But I just wanted to focus that you actually can. You can believe in a god or many gods or goddesses and still be queer. It's not that they're mutually exclusive sort of thing. So I had fun with that.
I love the flip of the light and the dark and the good and the evil. I think that's great. It's like
Yeah.
play with the tropes and expectations.
So I do have a question for Cody. Now that I thought of questions, you did a really great job. I thought in the story, it's short stories. It's hard to get everything into this little tiny space, but you did such a great job of balancing the humor and the darkness and creating sort of a sympathy for a murderer while also letting us hear the disdain. And how do you do that? I mean, when you come into a story, do you come into it knowing you're going to have this kind of balance, or is it something you work at as you're writing?
Yeah, this one started as a true crime story that I read in the newspaper. So from there, the scenario was already set up. I made it queer. In real life, it was, a man and a woman. But, every relationship I feel has those like light and dark aspects to it. And then this one, the challenge was starting from a very dark place. Like, could there be any light into it? And so the element of that was really the kind of sympathy, the like feeling sorry for the killer. And of course that's if you look at like domestic violence, you often have the victims sort of, feeling for the people who are putting them through that abuse. So I hope that's kind of the dynamic that I captured, the like complicated emotions that people feel in their relationships, even when there is violence involved. And it's just too bad. It's too bad Michael's such a dunce.
I loved how snarky the ghost was. I thought that was great.
It was, that was one of those things where it's like sometimes when you're writing, when like the voice comes through so strongly, that's rare in my experience. When I'm writing, it's usually I have to go find the voice, but sometimes they just come and they're shouting loudly.
I could really picture these two characters so clearly, even though one of them's dead and the other one never says anything,
Right.
Yeah, same.
Yeah.
It was really great. Well, I had a question for just general, because since we are writers and we do sometimes use it for different means, how did your writing go through the pandemic? Did it get better? Did it get worse? Did you like it? Did you not like it? Everybody always wants to know.
Yeah, it's an interesting question. Kim, do you want to take it?
Oh, sure, I'll start, but only because the book I just read to you, actually half the book takes place during the pandemic. So the other character is in Modesto in September of 2020, and so he had just moved to California in January when it seemed like a really good idea to move someplace he didn't know anybody and a new job, and then of course everything happens, and he's stuck inside his house, not just because of the pandemic, but also because at that point we had a lot of wildfires going in the air. The air was gross. Yeah. So he's stuck inside, and so it served as a plot point, because it's been so much a center part of all of our lives. I've probably gotten more writing done than I did before, but I've had to be a little bit more creative about it, because the rest of the household is home all the time too. So, at one point there were 5 of us either working from home or going to school from home in the same house. And so trying, sometimes there's like 4 or 5 Zooms going on at once. And so trying to find a space where you can kind of get into the right headspace for writing has occasionally been a little bit of a challenge.
Yeah, I can imagine 5 people all at once. Good God.
Yeah. One of them was my daughter's friend from college, and he described our household as controlled chaos, and I think that's a pretty good description.
Yeah.
I remember that period of time where the wildfire smoke was just socking. You couldn't go outside without getting covered in a campfire and inhaling campfire. So, yeah, that was pretty difficult. I don't have a good writing practice story about the coronavirus pandemic. I stopped writing for a few months. I was organizing a lot of writers events through Bookswell. So we had like about 1 per month, and I kept that going. And then kind of towards the middle to end of last year, I started to get back into writing. I'm working on the 3rd book in this series. So after Broken Mirror and Tortured Echoes is Altered Bodies. And I've been working on it for a while. It's much delayed, but I did start to make good progress towards the end of the year. So, there's all those jokes about like, oh, it's locked in. Why don't you write a novel? There's a lot that goes into how people set up their writing practices and maintain momentum, and I did not maintain momentum, but I think I've got some good momentum now. So one thing I'll say, part of it is like, I love science news. I just pay very close attention to that, and so part of the weird space that I found myself in was like paying attention out of curiosity but also dread, and like, so following everything as it comes out from both of those perspectives is this kind of mind screw up. Like, you're like, oh, I'm so curious about this, but it's actually really horrible how it's unfolding. So yeah, that's kind of what was on my mind.
Beginning of the pandemic, I just ate that up, man. I was so entranced with what was happening and just so terribly fascinated by it, and I had to stop because I got too embroiled in that. But for me, luckily, I'm teleworking, right, which is great. And actually, my workstation is at my parents' house, not where I live right now, only because we have 4 cats, and they would chew on all the wires, and so the equipment would get ruined by my cats. So I can't have that happen. So I did have that separation of like work life versus home life, which was really, really beneficial. And then for me, I've always had my writing as a sense of escapism, basically. Like I don't care about the outside world when I'm writing. I'm writing about swords and dragons and magic and adventures, and I don't care about the outside world when I do that. And throughout the pandemic, it really was a benefit for me just to dip into the world and escape for a little bit. So I was really happy that I had my writing, and I was working on book 2 that came out, and then I was also working on book 3. So it was good for me. I don't think I wrote as much as I probably would have before the pandemic, but at least I kept on writing.
One thing I've really liked is because I'm working from home for my day job too, as I've been able to kind of set my own schedule, and I'm naturally a night person, and so which works out well because everybody else goes to bed around 10 o'clock, so I can do my writing now from like 10 to 2 or something like that, and I love that. And it's the first time in my life I've really been able to totally do my own schedule, and it's made me so happy.
That's amazing. How do you not have your own schedule? You have like 60 books out, girl. Come on. How is that possible?
I'm good at writing in little pieces, The other thing is, normally I travel a lot, and obviously that didn't happen. So that was a shift, but it also, I usually write a lot while I'm traveling, but it also made a difference. So.
Yeah, for sure. Any other questions? So I think we have about 5 minutes left, right? Isn't it a 15-minute panel?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Right. Do we want to answer another question or go to close out?
Why don't we could talk about what we're all working on now. So Kelly, what are you working on now?
Good idea. Very good idea. So right now I am working on book 3 of the Broken Chronicles. Just like book 1 and book 2 have their own main characters. Book 1 is Misty's story. Book 2 is Arenda's. Book 3 is Adaris' story. And so I'm like 30,000 words into that right now. Still fleshing out the world and the characters and stuff. But yeah, that's where I'm going. Hopefully it's going to be published either late this year or early next year through Desert Plum Press.
How about you, Cody?
I'm slogging through the climax of book 3, so Alter Bodies. So I've been attacking it kind of in very small pieces because it's one of those sequences of scenes that's all the plot threads coming together and everything's complicated and they all come to one place. So it's kind of a bear to keep track of. So I'm just like picking at it little pieces at a time. I'm excited about it because I feel like it moves from the beginning to the middle and end. Like the trajectory I really like. It's unexpected, I think. I set it up to be a certain way and then it moves and shifts. So I always like kind of maybe like Kelly, like you were saying about the flipping the expectations of what people expect about light and dark. I love that stuff. So,
Yeah.
People might think it starts out one way, but and that there's this like bad AI that's going to take over the world, but things evolve in a different direction. So, and I think it's one that's, I don't know, that I'm excited about. So fingers crossed, it all goes well.
So I'm in sort of editing hell right now. Somehow I'm in the middle of edits of that space opera and a long fantasy novel and 2 short stories and trying to finish up a holiday story. So I'm not doing a whole lot of writing at the moment, and it's a little bit hard to kind of skip from outer space to my fantasy world to my contemporary short story. So that's pretty much where I'm at, is dealing with all my inadequacies as a writer.
Which holiday?
It's Hanukkah, because I'd like to do my winter holiday stories early, so they're set. So there aren't enough Hanukkah stories, so it's a little bit difficult. I like to try and write my winter holiday stories before it gets to be 110 here, because it's really hard to think winter when it's miserable outside. So
It's really smart to do it ahead of time too, though. Good job.
well, I'm trying.
Kelly, you mentioned that you were in Alaska. In terms of the settings that you choose to write in, would people identify them as like Alaska, or do you pick something that's far away from where you were living through?
My settings have some Alaska in it, but not as much as you would think, because most of my settings is not winter based. It's not, I mean, there are mountains in my world, but it's not these kind of mountains. I picked them just because I love Alaska and I think it's great, but I also want to get away from here sometimes. And so I do that in my stories. And there are lots of trees and deserts and flatlands, whereas here there are ton of mountains, which is awesome. But yeah, I do live in Alaska. We actually got 2 feet of snow on Thursday. I couldn't go to work. It was hilarious.
It must take a lot of snow to have a snow day in Alaska.
I mean, technically we shouldn't even had a snow day because we're all teleworking, but I'm not working from here. I'm working from mom and dad's house. So I couldn't get there. I tried walking, like it's only a mile away, and I tried walking and I couldn't get there. So snow day. It was great.
You have far more grit than I do.
You just get used to it. I could not imagine being in 100-degree weather. That would just put me flat on my ass.
It's rough, and it lasts like, I don't know, like where you are, Kim, but here in LA, it's like it can be hot for like 4 months.
Oh my God.
I'm in the Central Valley, so it's pretty much like hell itself during the summer. Like if we have a high that's only 90, we feel pretty good about it, but it cools off at night. That's what we tell each other. At least it's dry heat and it cools off at night, but it's still, when you see the temperature way up in those triple digits, it's miserable.
Yeah.
Wow, that's amazing. Oh, well, look, like we just clicked over to 3:50 my time, so 4:50 your time, wherever y'all live. So we should probably wrap it up because I know Rainbow Space Magic has a lot of things happening. But thank you guys so much for hanging out with me. This was really fun.
This was great fun. Thank you, everybody.
Yeah, thanks, Kelly. Thanks, Kim. And thanks to everyone who's here. You can, if you
Yeah,
want to continue the discussion, ask us more questions, we'll be on the Discord throughout the convention.